This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Thanks very much, Fabrice. It's a great pleasure, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak today, but also to giving me the opportunity to come to Paris. It's been great, and I've loved talking to people, and I've done lots of good work. So far, so good, as they say. My title today is Rethinking Australia after 1788, but I should have included New Zealand, given the recent news. Can anyone tell me which of the two flags is Australia and which of the ones is New Zealand?
This is Australia to the right and New Zealand to the left.
Yeah. Okay.
Am I right?
Yep. Yeah. Lots of people don't get that one right, so you're in a privileged company. And of course, I should have included New Zealand because of their vote recently to retain the flag with the Union Jack on it. Because I think it makes the point, one of the points that I want to make today about the continuing existence of British values and of a British perspective in the antipodes. What I want to talk about today is some new work that I've started to do on a discourse about modern Australia. And what I want to try and do is reverse engineer. Do you have that term here yet? It's like start at the end and work backwards. What I want to try and do is reverse engineer modern Australia to see if I can find some of the origins or the traditions, the beginning of the traditions which shape the modern nation. Now, I'm wary of Foucault's warning about looking for the origins of anything, but I feel reasonably confident because 1788 is such an extraordinarily important dividing line in the long history of the Australian continent, which is when the British turned up, that it's not as difficult for me to search for origins without never being able to find the start. So I want to start with a quotation from Karl Marx, because I think in all sorts of ways it helps to understand the situation of modern Australia and the way in which we have to think about our past. I think to summarise Australia today would be to see it in many ways as a paradox, a nation of paradoxes, or as a sort of a grand contradiction in its fundamental values. I want to talk about that under three headings in my paper today. One is the idea of Australia as an innovative and advanced democracy. I want to talk about Australia and its legacy of racism. And I want to talk about Australia and its legacy, its commitment to the idea of a popular constitutionalism. So I'll work my way through those three areas, and I really look forward to having some feedback on how you think they summarise an Australian outlook. Okay, so I started off by saying that New Zealand ought to have been included, and I do so for a couple of reasons. One is to give you some statistics about the continued support for Britain in the antipodes. The recent flag referendum earlier in this month showed well over 56% of people supporting the retention of a flag with the Union Jack on it, which of course has extraordinary symbolic significance in respect of its colonial past. Now, Australians might like to have a laugh about that they've managed to vote to keep the flag with the Union Jack, apart from the fact that our flag has the Union Jack on it as well. And also and this was probably one of the worst days of my life, rejected a referendum to become a republic in November 1999, and you'll notice that the no figure was 54.8, so not far off the New Zealand figure for retaining the flag. But it also seemed to me to chime in with some other figures. But firstly, let me show you my one piece of comfort. The red is where the no vote was good. The little green spot there is where we did vote for a republic, and that's the Australian Capital Territory. So I now live in the Republic of Canberra. We are the only Republican corner of a massive continent. But those figures, 56, 57% of the population who are basically voting to retain some visual or symbolic connection to the British Empire, also strikes me as being quite similar to the figures in relation to the Scottish independence referendum in September 2014, where you'll notice again about 55% of the people voted to remain as part of the United Kingdom. And I wonder what impact that might have in June this year when Britain's vote to remain in the EU or not. Because there seems to me to be something very sticky about Britishness. It seems to cling to people in interesting ways. And I wonder whether that will result in people in the United Kingdom itself voting to return to its Anglophone Commonwealth or not. So, to the first of my three areas to talk to today. The first is that Australia is, I think by any standards, a successful and innovative democracy. The most recent results that I could find on those international surveys of the health of the democracy shows 10 out of 150, 10 out of 167, 9 out of 98. These are, I think, a relatively good indicator that Australia's democratic institutions are very robust and among the freest and fairest in the world, well ahead of Britain, and ahead of France too, I should point out. France is about 15 in those rankings I looked up. So it's a successful democracy by world standards today. It's also the heir of a long tradition of democracy. You'll notice there the key indicators of 19th century political, the 19th century political agenda: manhood suffrage, the secret ballot, shorter parliaments, the payment of MPs, no property qualification to stand for parliament, were all granted in the Australian colonies very early on in the 19th century. If you look at the major colonies of South Australia, Victoria and New South Wales, you see that universal suffrage was granted in this time in the middle of the 1850s, basically. And at the same time, the Australian colonies were given constitutions of their own. And that meant that they had responsible government, what we call responsible government, which meant that their ministries were elected by the people. So there was a form of popular sovereignty enacted in Australia very early on by world standards. And that is interesting. It's worth comparing that to the same reforms in Britain. Australia in the middle of the 19th century is an extraordinarily, overwhelmingly Anglo-Celtic country, and yet its political system is very quickly well in advance of Britain itself. So whereas most of the Australian colonies are getting the vote in the middle of the 19th century, manhood suffrage, let me emphasise the manhood suffrage, and the secret ballot and payment of MPs, you'll notice that those reforms only come in Britain at least 2 generations later, a long period of time. Full manhood suffrage in Britain not until 1918, when it's granted in Victoria and South Australia and New South Wales and Queensland in the middle of the 1850s. And one of the consequences of that is a change in the dynamics of the way in which the political nation in Australia operates. So, for example, on our $5 note is a man called Henry Parkes. Now, Henry Parkes was arrived in Australia in 1840, and he had been, before he left, a radical, a Chartist in Birmingham, where he was born. A member of the Birmingham Political Union in 1832 and a Chartist in 1838-39, before he migrated. Now, Henry Parkes is known in Australia as the father of the Australian Constitution. He was instrumental in bringing about the federation of the Australian colonies later in the century. Yet he is a member of the cabinet and the Premier of New South Wales before those who he was struggling for the vote with in Britain have even got the vote. He first enters Parliament in 1856. By 1866 he's become a cabinet minister and so forth. So he ends up in political power while those who he was fighting for political power in Britain didn't even have the vote. So what this means is that politics is transformed by reform in the second half of the 19th century. Basically, there's been a change from the struggle to be part of the political nation to the struggle for power within it. That's a major transformation. It's also a period of social transformation in Australia. The discovery of gold, of course, occurs in 1852, which changes the economy dramatically and has a huge impact on the population. So in 1840 the population's 200,000. In 1850 that's grown to 400,000, mainly free settlers by this stage. By 1860, after the discovery of gold, it's grown to 1.1 million. So a huge influx of people, overwhelmingly from Britain and Ireland, in the middle of the 19th century, at the same time as the granting of extensive political rights in the community. So basically, to summarise, Australia is 50 years ahead of Britain politically by 1860. And not only Henry Parkes, let me stress, the 1850s and 60s brought many former Chartists to Australia. They basically gave up on the struggle for political reform in Britain and came to Australia. Australia's one revolutionary moment, the Eureka Rebellion in 1854 at Ballarat in Victoria, was part of a broader campaign for reform on the goldfields. Involved in the Eureka Stockade were many former Chartists, names that you'll know: George Black, Holyoake's brother, John Bassam Humphrey. These are leading figures in the Chartist movement in Britain who were involved in Australia's first rebellion in 1854. And you can see that influence when you look at the demands of the Ballarat Reform Union, as it was called then, Reform League, that they were agitating for in 1854. It's basically a hybrid version of the People's Charter. They're campaigning for the full political rights of the people, a full and fair representation, manhood suffrage, no property qualification, payment of members, short duration of parliaments. That's the People's Charter. Plus no miners' licence fees and access to the land. Again, access to the land being a core demand of British political radicals in the middle of the 19th century. The difference here is that these campaigns are successful. Within a very short period of time, those demands are met in the Australian colonies. And I think you can see a distinctive Chartist or British radical influence on that major development. Australia also goes on to have, during the second half of the 19th century, some significant reforms comparable to the rest of the Anglophone world. For example, in 1902, Australia is one of the first places in the world to grant women's suffrage at national elections. And it's probably the earliest place in the world in South Australia, which women's suffrage comes in 1895. Again, this is a generation ahead of the granting of the vote in Britain to women. In 1901, Australia is the first country in the world to submit a constitution to a popular vote. From 1858 onwards, in different trades accumulating over the 19th century, Australia is the first jurisdiction to introduce the 8-hour working day. And in 1904, it establishes a conciliation and arbitration court at the Commonwealth level to arbitrate industrial disputes and to set what was called the living wage or the basic wage, to control wages in the free market. Significant social reform, again, that I don't think Britain's ever had a conciliation and arbitration court. So again, politically well in advance of Britain itself. So if we can call Australia today a successful and innovative democracy, we can see that that's a heritage that stems back a considerable period of time to the middle of the 19th century. But alongside that is a legacy of racism. In 2008, the Prime Minister of Australia, Kevin Rudd, apologised to Indigenous people for the past wrongs that had been done since British colonisation in 1788. And he referred to it as a stain on the nation's soul, and that's exactly what it was, and unfortunately still is. For Indigenous people, 1788, when the British first arrived in New South Wales, was an unmitigated disaster that's led to dispossession of their land, decimation of the population, and to grinding inequality, appalling inequality. The Indigenous population of Australia is now only 2.7%. And I think that appalling inequality is evident in a number of social indicators. These images are quite confronting of Indigenous children and families and communities in rural Australia and remote Australia. Among Indigenous people, there is a 35% unemployment rate compared to 5% nationally. Indigenous people comprise 25% of all prisoners in Australian jails, despite the fact that they're only 2.7% of the population. Indigenous prisoners comprise 18% of all deaths in custody in Australian jails. There are 8 times the number of Indigenous children in child protection as in the rest of Australia. The suicide rate for men is 2.5 times higher among Indigenous people and 3.4 times higher among Indigenous women. In terms of health, the mortality rate, the average age of death for men among Indigenous people is 67, which is 11.5 years less than non-Indigenous men, and 9 years less than women. 64% of deaths among Indigenous people are below the age of 65, whereas 20% is the rate among non-Indigenous people. So it is and remains a stain on the nation's soul, is the treatment of Indigenous people, which is underpinned, in my view, by a residual racism in the country. And this racist legacy is also part of the British heritage of Australia. At 1901, when Australia became a nation, and those culmination of those political innovations was taking place, the Indigenous people were dehumanised. They were basically no longer counted in the census. And in some state jurisdictions, they were classified as flora and fauna. And the Constitution was only amended in 1967 to include Indigenous people as part of the nation by counting them in the census. 1901 was also the introduction of what's known as the White Australia policy, which was a very severe immigration restriction act to keep Australia basically an Anglophone British nation. The origin of the White Australia policy, I think, in Australia is the 1850s. So again, going alongside these extraordinary developments in political rights is the growth of a virulent racism, firstly against Chinese people. This is a cartoon from the 1880s, which you can see has the Australian community being strangled by a Chinese octopus, and immorality, smallpox, opium, infanticide, cheap labour are all seen as threats to the white British population at that time. It's also reflected in major riots on the goldfields, where there are anti-Chinese riots against Chinese miners on the goldfields. An important point that I want to make here is that this is also a Chartist legacy, that the people who are conducting these riots are radicals. In fact, I think the last existing Chartist banner, radical banner, is actually in colonial New South Wales. And that's it there. I found it mouldering in a local history museum, but that's a banner that says roll up, call to arms, no Chinese, and in the centre is the flag of Australian independence, the Southern Cross. And the people who made that flag, who carried that flag to the riots, were ex-British radicals. Their sense of their own political rights was not extended to people who were not considered part of the political nation. Let me give you just a few quotations that underpin this. These are from the Age newspaper, published in Melbourne. Now let me stress, this is a newspaper that's owned and edited by political radicals. And so these are people who in Britain would be struggling for the rights that are enjoyed in the colonies, but have lost any sense of the extension of those rights to people who are not British. So you can see Victoria is still invaded by the hordes of the Chinese, whose unwelcome presence in the first is one of the first objectives perceptible to the new chums. So a new chum is someone just arriving in the country. The rapidly increasing number of this race has created a considerable alarm, and their filthy and immoral habits have excited the utmost abhorrence, especially upon the goldfields. The European diggers rose en masse there, talking about the riots, a few days ago, and drove 1,500 Chinese off the Buckland diggings. Of course, similar means are likely to be adopted elsewhere. And again here, any palaver about the absolute equality of man is altogether out of place in such circumstances, for the utmost extravagance, even of extreme democracy, goes no further than asserting equality among those who are of the same nation and trained under the same institutions. Democrats are generally great sticklers for nationality. Hence their watchword generally are America for the Americans, Ireland for the Irish, Italy for the Italians, etc. For ourselves, our extreme democracy consists of claiming Victoria for the Victorians. And again, finally, politically, it is in every way undesirable that we should have here many thousands of a class no better than serfs or slaves, a class that can neither be made to comprehend or exercise their political rights of free citizens. The political ideal at which the colony should aim is precisely the reverse of that. It should be our ambition and our resolve to form a community in which every individual should understand, appreciate and exercise all the rights and duties of free men. Ours should be, in the noblest sense, a commonwealth. But it's not a commonwealth that includes people of other races. It's a commonwealth defined by a narrative around rights. And it's important to understand that the prosecution of this case is done through the lens of those rights. It's a political discourse that involves the assertion of the right to rebel. So the Eureka Stockade, the riots on the goldfields are claimed as the right to rebel against unfair authority. And that's reflected in the demands that are made on Parliament to introduce laws. Now that's evident in two respects. All those who were arrested for their activities at Eureka, so a rebellion in favour of political rights, were acquitted by the courts. And all those arrested for rioting against the Chinese were acquitted by the courts. So the legal system is brought to bear not only to assert rights in a positive sense, but also to assert exclusion on the basis of race. And of course Parliament itself succumbs to the demand for the introduction of legislation. And so in 1855 a £10 entry tax is imposed on Chinese miners into Australia, and ships are only allowed to carry one Chinese person for every 10 tonnes of the ship. In 1857 an extra mining tax is imposed on Chinese miners, and it's levied every 2 months, not annually. In 1859 these laws are repealed, but they're replaced by an annual tax of £4 as a residence fee, and an entry tax to the colony of £40. And similar laws are established in New South Wales and in South Australia as to Victoria. In 1865 these laws are updated again to institute what they call protection and registration of Chinese miners, which also allowed them to be relocated by the authority. And at that stage, it specifically indicates that they don't have the right to vote. In 1881, there's a reimposition of the entry tax on Chinese miners. And so you'll see that the White Australia policy, which imposes an extraordinarily complex and difficult set of barriers on immigration for non-British, non-Anglophone people, is one in a whole series of legislation that's imposed on the basis of race. But the important point is that this is justified through a discourse of rights that are seen as a British inheritance. And in fact, for Labor historians, it's important to recognise that support for the White Australia policy continues through senior Labor figures. So here you have Ebenezer Syme, the Chartist, writing those editorials. But well into the 20th century, you have Labor leaders also endorsing the idea of a white Australia. The ideals towards which every Australian who loves his country and believes in its future greatness would desire to strive might well be stated as being to secure our national safety and to ensure the maintenance of our White Australia policy, to continue as an integral portion of the British Empire, and to play our full part as a great self-governing dominion. 1923. The great hero of the Second World War, Prime Minister John Curtin, a socialist, and a protege of Tom Mann, the great British socialist and trade unionist. This country shall remain forever the home of the descendants of those people who came here in peace in order to establish in the South Seas an outpost of the British race. And it's not until 1974-75 that the last aspects of the White Australia policy are finally revealed. But as I said, in relation to indigenous people, I don't think the residual racism has gone away yet. And that's also reflected in the treatment of refugees attempting to arrive in Australia. At the moment, 59%, according to opinion polls, support the government's policies in relation to refugees, which is not to allow them to land on mainland Australia, but to house them in camps on islands, offshore islands. 60% of people support an increased severity to the policy. Only 27% of people believe that refugees should have access to welfare benefits, even if they are granted political asylum. So again, this is a camp for people claiming political asylum or refugee status in Australia. Now that's another stain on the national soul, as far as I can see. And yet, in a democracy, it's supported by a considerable majority of the people. And so therefore it's expressed through those advanced political rights and that discourse that that I mentioned earlier. Okay, to the last part of my talk, which is Marx's last nightmare, and that's what I've called popular constitutionalism or residual monarchism in Australia, which I think helps to understand why Australia rejected the referendum on the Republic. There were many reasons, and I could spend another hour talking about that, but it would be too painful for me, and this next bit's going to be painful enough as it is. The residual monarchism is definitely part of the British legacy. Here's Ebenezer Syme again, who's editor of The Age, former Chartist, talking about King Alfred and the historic notion that British kings were supporters of popular rights. There was not a subject of the Saxon Alfred whose rights were not guaranteed to him by law, and who did not find in the king a powerful protector. Now this is an extraordinarily powerful trope in British colonies of settlement, but it's also an important trope among British radicals themselves in Britain. And you see this continue right through the last 200 years of British history, where underpinning its commitment to democratic institutions is a residual attachment to monarchy. So here Queen Victoria is eulogised as a true mother who loves her children. Here's an award-winning poem written after Queen Victoria dies. Of progress, liberty and peace the banners she unfurled, to sanctify, to purify, to elevate the world. 1901, same year as Federation. When King Edward VII died in 1910, and now what have we lost in the death of King Edward? Something more than a monarch, something infinitely greater than the mere official occupant of a high position. It is not too much to say that in him his subjects have lost a personal friend. 1936, the death of King George V. In the hands of King George, those royal privileges were no less secure than in the hands of his immediate predecessors, and indeed it may be claimed that under this intensely sympathetic ruler, a man gifted with splendid qualities of heart and hand, whose whole imperial family experienced a guidance which was a wise in character and as it was tactful in its respect of true democracy. Monarchy not incompatible with democracy. 1936, the death of George V. Again, democracy in the British Empire chooses to be ruled by a king. It looks to the king for leadership, and especially and confidently in a time of crisis. Notice, democracy chooses to have a king. In the Republican referendum, Australian voters chose to remain a monarchy. So the values of democracy that have been established in Australia since the mid-1850s are not seen as incompatible with monarchy. Again, in 1952, when George VI dies. But everywhere in the Commonwealth and Empire, as well as in the circles near the throne itself, there will be a deep sense of personal loss. For George VI was a man of warm human qualities. He was in every way suited for kingship in a democratic age. For he had not only virtue, strength of character and courage, but also an outlook that caused him to have as much regard for the welfare of the humblest subjects as the most exalted. Again, this extraordinary investment in the power of monarchy in a direct relationship to the democratic polity. And as late as 2013, Prime Minister Julia Gillard talking about Queen Elizabeth and the Commonwealth. The institution of the head of the Commonwealth, standing as it does above individual governments, has been an asset for the Commonwealth since its foundation, and we need not be reticent about its future. For Australia's part, I am sure the Queen's successor as monarch will one day serve as head of the Commonwealth with the same distinction as Her Majesty has done. And again, I'm not going to make any date predictions on either the ascension to the throne of Prince William or the date of this nation becoming a republic. Now, for some Republicans, there's a hope invested in the fact that the populace likes Queen Elizabeth, Prince Charles is not popular, so that when Prince Charles becomes king, there'll be another opportunity for Australia to become a republic. I unfortunately am not optimistic in this regard, because I think the major asset of the British royal family is one generation later. We all know that the British royal family has been able to survive bad kings before, and already in Prince William they have a perfectly ready-made way of overcoming any damage that's done by Charles. When he visited Australia in 2011, he did what previous monarchs have done on visiting and visitors, establishing that reputation among the people. At major floods where 35 people were killed and hundreds of homes were ruined, he went straight to the source of the problems and went amongst his people, and is quoted as saying, "I'm full of admiration for their courage and skill. Queenslanders are renowned for their true grit, for their resilience and courage. On behalf of the Queen, the Prince of Wales and other members of my family, I would like to extend heartfelt condolences to all in Australia who have lost family members and friends in these terrible national disasters." So you can see again, building on that trope of being one of the family, being someone at the kitchen table, someone who can stand above politics and be one of the people. So then, if I was to say, what is Marx's nightmare in relation to republicanism? It's that. And you have to remember, as a footnote, that Kate is an Australian from Tasmania. So, Australia remains a nation of paradoxes. It's an advanced, innovative democracy that led the world in the reception of political rights and freedoms, but that advanced political legacy is undermined by virulent racism and prejudice and a form of attachment to monarchy which is out of keeping with that. The important point is, though, that the racism and the monarchism are part of the same discourse. They're not discordant. They're part of the notion of the rights of the freeborn British. And therefore there is no surprise that the New Zealanders voted to retain the Union flag as part of its national flag. Just as, I hate to admit, there was no surprise when Australians voted to retain the monarchy in our Republican referendum. So, thank you very much.